Hello, and welcome to part 3 of my short story, The Eighth Dwarf, about Walt Disney's making of his first animated feature. I'm not quite sure how well this is going. In fact, I have a distinct fear I'm making a fool of myself, but we're just going to press on. So as you'll recall from part 2, Sleazy went to the Macombo nightclub in West Hollywood to confront Snow White's abuser, who turns out to be no one less than Walt Disney. The two men kind of get into it together, threatening each other, and the situation concludes unresolved. So here we go with part 3 of The Eighth Dwarf. Working for Walt Disney was never easy. The guy was a perfectionist, what people today would call a control freak. For all of his talk about collaboration, Walt's was the only opinion that ever mattered. The animators were irrelevant. He could also be cruel. One day, while reviewing some bullpen sketches he didn't like, he began yanking the drawings off the bulletin board one by one, ripping them up in half and letting them fall to the floor. You soon learned never to argue with the guy. Walt didn't think twice about making you do something over he didn't like. Cost was no object. Pleasing Walt was the point. And since Walt had no problem embarrassing an employee in front of the staff, people were afraid of him. More than one animator threw up before presenting to Walt. He had everybody cowed. Walt had a dirty secret, though. He couldn't draw worth a damn. He didn't even come up with Mickey Mouse. That was a guy with the ridiculous name of Oob Eworks who worked for him. Walt just took the credit. If that's not bad enough, Walt wanted to call Mickey Mortimer Mouse until his wife talked him out of it. Years later, after Oob had been pushed out and was teaching at a vocational school, Walt still refused to acknowledge his contribution. That's how grateful he was. In other words, if Walt Disney was a genius, it was in knowing how to use other people's ideas. I guess that's a talent of a sort, just not the same thing. Having said this, Snow White was a difficult time for Walt. He and his wife Lillian were talking divorce, and the studio had serious money problems. Lillian never showed much interest in Walt's work. She liked the money, sure, but cartoons weren't her thing. I guess that's why Walt went elsewhere for a sympathetic ear. Our cash flow problem was real enough, though. The cartoon business is so labor-intensive, it costs a fortune to produce anything. Truth is, Walt hawked everything he had, including the rights to Mickey Mouse, to make Snow White. There was just too much at stake for him to fail. Principal filming began on Snow White and the Eight Dwarfs in February 1936. There were the usual problems. The biggest one was that our studio didn't know how to draw people. Sure, we were great at drawing hungry wolves and dancing pigs, but realistic-looking human beings was a problem for us. That's why Walt auditioned people for the lead in Snow White. Deanna Durbin was on the list, as were a few others who might surprise you. But like I've said, Walt had his heart set on Snowy from the start. She had just the right combination of what he called youthfulness and nubile vigor. She was plenty nubile, all right. The girl had a rack like the Hindenburg. We got around it, though, by binding her chest, but it was a problem every time we tried to shoot her in profile. The other casting challenge was the prince. The guy we hired turned out to be so light in his loafers he made Danny Kaye look straight. The audience didn't know this, of course, but it's bad for business to have your male lead out chasing guys at night. Believe it or not, it was also a crime back then. Walt had to bail Prince Charming out of jail more than once for getting caught with his wiener out during a vice raid. Of course, no one cares about that stuff now. It's either old news, politically incorrect, or nobody even knows what you're talking about. That's one of the drawbacks of getting old, I guess. But you don't have to like it. The dwarves were the easiest to cast, maybe because there wasn't much choice. They were a great bunch of guys, easygoing and full of laughs. But when two complained they were underpaid, Walt fired them. He never did the firing, of course. Walt may have been a bully, but he was a coward as well. Another misconception is that the first 7 dwarves were always named Sleepy, Dopey, Doc, Bashful, Sneezy, Grumpy, and Happy. That wasn't the case. Walt's original list included such clunkers as Scrappy, Cranky, Dirty, Baldy, Flabby, Lazy, and Chesty. "We already got a Chesty," Sleazy would joke, "and she's not a dwarf." That crack made Snow White blush, but Walt laughed, which surprised me because normally he acted the prude. Once rehearsals were over and the production ramped up, things ran more smoothly. Sleazy helped Snowy with her lines, and I don't mean by sticking his hand up her skirt. He always showed up at her apartment promptly at 6 every morning to make sure she wasn't late for her 7 a.m. call. Occasionally, Sleazy would bump into Walt coming out of Snowy's at that hour. The two never said anything, just nodded and went their respective ways, but you could feel the tension. Clearly, Sleazy was in love with Snow White. She may even have encouraged him, though the relationship wasn't carnal. In fact, it was a hard situation to read. A lot of Hollywood ingenues have a mercenary streak a mile wide, but Snowy seemed to genuinely care for Sleazy. Of course, it's flattering to have someone devoted to you, even if they're only waist high. But Snowy's affection was genuine, which is why Sleazy couldn't stand the fact she had a drug problem. "I hate what you're doing to yourself," Sleazy told her. "Why do you take that stuff?" "It's something I need, Sleazy. Your pain is your height." And here she lovingly patted the top of his head. "But mine goes deeper." A lot of actresses use pills or booze to overcome their nerves. But when Sleazy pushed, Snow White admitted that heroin helped produce that dreamy, floating effect Walt wanted in her scenes. "How else can I charm the bird from the trees?" she said with a smile. "But that stuff will kill you." "It's what Walt wants. I can't disappoint him." Wait a minute. Is Walt the one giving you this stuff? Sometimes our intuition is such that we know something is true the moment we say it aloud, which is how Sleazy came to realize Walt Disney was doping Snow White. In other words, when the cameras rolled, Snowy was high. Jesus Christ, Snowy! He gives you junk just to get a performance? Snow White said nothing, just stroked Sleazy's cheek and smiled wanly. If that mope thinks he can get away with this, he's got another thing coming. What are you thinking, Sleazy? I'm gonna fix him and his silly symphonies for good. Be careful, Sleazy. Walt is a dangerous man. Then reaching into her purse, Snow White pulled out a length of surgical hose and handed it to him. Now be a dear and tie me off. It's time for my shot. It didn't take Sleazy long to figure out where the chink in Disney's armor was. Money had always been a problem for Walt. He may have insisted on creative control, but he owed everybody in town. And so Sleazy, with one well-placed phone call, hit Walt where it hurt most, his bankers. Walt had no idea Sleazy had dropped a dime on his spending practices, even though he had a nose for that sort of thing. As a result, it came as a surprise when the stuffed shirts at Bank of America demanded Walt fly up to San Francisco for a meeting to discuss how their money was being spent. They were particularly concerned about unitemized production costs, which Sleazy had told them included certain pharmaceuticals. Walt always hated the money men. As he said in the car coming in from the airport, "You can never win with the bankers, and this one's run by a wop. He should be making olive oil, not bank loans." Bank of America was the fourth largest financial institution in the United States back then, and they weren't shy about letting you know it. Their headquarters was a 7-story granite building of what else? Italianate design, bordering the intersection of Market, Powell, and Eddy in San Francisco. It looked more like a tomb than a bank, and it housed the biggest bunch of stiffs you could possibly imagine. Because Walt owned the studio outright, he spent money the way he wanted. It was all about the creative product, not industrial efficiency. But though Walt's kind of quality resulted in some terrific cartoons, it also cost a bundle. Bankers may know how to make money, but they knew nothing about making cartoons, which is exactly what Walt counted on. As we entered the Bank of America's boardroom, there were nearly a dozen men waiting for us, none of them smiling. The vast room was paneled in wood so dark it sucked the sunlight right out of the air. A thick cornice overhead felt like a tidal wave about to crash upon us. I could see the famous Disney charm was going to have difficulty warming up this crowd, but to his credit, Walt seemed unruffled. I'd already warned him not to talk anything but about the picture. I knew if the bankers got wind of his other plans, they'd go nuts. This was before the theme park, the cruise ships, the Broadway musicals, and the retail stores. But Walt was already thinking about that stuff, even back then. "Please, Walt," I begged, "nothing about Disneylandia. We've got to stick to business." The truth is, as far as Bank of America was concerned, Walt Disney was no different than any other fast-talking Hollywood dreamer trying to make it with the odds stacked against them. Why, Bank of America weren't even sure they wanted to invest in motion pictures. One of the bankers, sitting at the table, a man whose name I've long since forgotten, got right to the point. "Why would anyone sit through a feature-length cartoon, Mr. Disney?" Walt didn't hesitate and began ticking off talking points with his fingers. "This picture's got everything. There's a prince, a girl, a wicked stepmother, and dwarfs for comic relief. On top of that, we've got romance, fight scenes, and a chase, plus it's a musical. We can't miss." "Cartoons are for children, Mr. Disney. What makes you think adults will want to see it?" True, Snow White and the 8 Dwarfs has never been done before, but that's why people will go. It's got none of the childishness of regular cartoons, Disney said, and it plumbs the emotional depths of each character. No cartoon has ever made you cry before. Snow White will be the first. The bankers looked at Walt Disney blankly. They had no idea what he was talking about. That's when Walt pushed back his chair, stood up from the table, and began acting out the movie's opening scene. Look, when Snow White first comes out, you see a beautiful young girl, graceful and full of joy. As she dances, she raises her arms to the sky, and the birds are so charmed they land on her finger. As she twirls about, we catch a brief glimpse of her little white panties. See, we even get sex in this thing. And she breaks into a song that advances the story. By God, it'll be swell. Yes, another banker said impatiently, but look at your animation costs. You're way over budget. Walt was not in the least flustered. Audiences are accustomed to depth in live-action films, gentlemen. You can't show them something flat and one-dimensional for 80 minutes. They'll get bored. Okay, I've hired more animators than budgeted, but that's so Snow White will have a 3-dimensional look. It's money well spent. What's this about making your own pigments? A third banker interrupted. It's the world's first color feature. We have to get the colors right. But 1,200 of them, Mr. Disney? I wouldn't think there are that many colors in the universe. Yes, gentlemen, it's cheaper to buy colors commercially, but then Snow White wouldn't be something people would pay money to see. I'm not sure you've answered our questions, Mr. Disney, a walrus-faced banker interjected. Gentlemen, please, I mortgaged my home to make the first Mickey Mouse short, and it was a success. Snow White is going to be even bigger. I'm going to make you a hat full of money. Incredibly, the one thing the bankers didn't ask about was our unitemized list of production expenses. Sleazy knew the cost of Snow White's drug habit was somewhere in that list, but all the bankers cared about once Walt got through with them was that Snow White be a hit. A German immigrant with a taste for dope was beyond their ken. By the time Walt finished speaking, Bank of America was not only comfortable with their original loan, they lent him more money. I was concerned Walt had raised the stakes so high we'd never earn it back, but he was exuberant. Once we got to Burbank, the first thing he did was call a studio-wide meeting. Standing on a chair with his rolled-up shirt sleeves, he addressed the crowd of 700 men and women in his warm Dutch uncle-y style. Business gets in the way of creativity, he told them. That's why we don't answer to anyone. It wasn't true, of course. We answered to Bank of America to the tune of $4.5 million. But Walt protected his animators from the bean counters. Since there had been rumors the bank was about to take us over, Walt wanted the staff to know he'd never give in to financial pressure. To his credit, they ate it up almost as much as the bankers in San Francisco. As a sop to the budget cutters, Walt did agree to chop one principal cast member. And since Bank of America thought 7 dwarves was plenty, you can guess who got chopped. But money wasn't Walt's only problem. Snow White was pregnant. Okay, that concludes part 3 of The Eighth Dwarf. Stay tuned for part 4. Thanks so much for listening.